Hello and welcome back to the Center for Critical and Cultural Theory. My name is Dr. Roger Green. This is going to be another installment in our Intro to Critical Theory series. We've been working through a number of different uh, authors, and we've gotten now to Marcuse. In my last video lecture, I gave a brief account of um, just some basic Freudian concepts here. And I think I didn't go into a whole unpacking of the big argument of Eros and civilization here. For those who are really interested in it, as I mentioned in my last lecture, I have a book called A Transatlantic Political Theology of Psychedelic Aesthetics. And there's much more going on in that book than what I'm talking about in this lecture, but I was dealing with the arrival of Frankfurt School types of critical theory and the impact or influence of thinkers like Marcuse on the psychedelic movement, among other things. There's a lot going on in that particular book. So it's hard sometimes for me to divorce myself from a lot of different thinking I've done along the lines with Marcuse. He's been a kind of constant companion for me. One Dimensional Man, when I was in my early 20s, was a very big book for me. And there is a way that philosophers come in and out of fashion. I totally understand that. He was all the rage in the late 60s and 70s, and then he kind of disappeared for a while. And now, in the kind of 50-year-ish or low 50 plus a few odd years um, anniversary of like May of 1968, which we haven't talked a whole lot about in this class, but the uprisings around the whole globe, not just in the United States or France, but in May of 1968, we kind of see in recent years a kind of way of maybe it's because a lot of people from that generation are dying, maybe or still in some cases still in office. People are arguing about Joe Biden being too old and all of that sort of stuff. Although I wouldn't exactly consider him like part of the the psychedelic movement or anything. But definitely influenced in that kind of post 1960s uh, period, where we've had the liberals on the left in the United States tend to narrate that as a kind of golden period because is a lot of civil rights legislation, for example, that comes out of the uprisings and the protest movements of the 1960s, whereas conservatives tend to have read that period as one through a narrative of decline in the United States anyway. And that this is, when somebody like Donald Trump is saying like make America great again, a lot of times the perception is going back to like a pre-1960s realm of thought, which I don't think is necessarily possible, but like putting all of that aside, just the rhetoric of it is already kind of has a sort of pre-1960s notion built into it, and all of the implications of does going back to that time period really mean a time when America was really great? Was it great when there was racial suppression and segregation, for example? Same thing with constitutional originalists, as they like to call themselves, or people who want to, um, push back before the amendments after the end of the Civil War. Do they not count as part of the Constitution because you want to go back further? Do we want to go back to a time when there's slavery? So all of that is a little bit of a just setup here for digging into Marcuse's essay for this contextualized reading, which is called Repressive Tolerance. And I was telling my face-to-face students the other day that I feel like, although the readings in this class are really difficult, this one I feel like is especially difficult because uh, I think because it resonates a little bit right now, um, see if I can get this to share the screen with you. There we are. Um, because of things like the post January 6th moment that we are living in, and so much of what is going on in university campus culture. And there's so much that we've already read that I feel like the way I designed this course, we read all the way up through Wendy Brown and Glenn Sean Coulthard, right? And then we went backwards, and now we're kind of coming forwards again, and now we're in the 1960s. And so I feel like Marcuse is doing a lot of glue work here, especially in discussions in recent years on university campuses around free speech, for example, around so-called wokeism. And I really try not to use that term a whole lot, um, because of the ways that it shows up in explicitly right-wing campaign rhetoric. So in someone like Ron DeSantis, he actually, it's very intentional that they use the word woke to vilify the things that they don't like to see in their kind of repositioning of the so-called culture wars, so against LGBTQ people or something like that. Um, and yet we see on the liberal left as well, critiques of the ways that university culture has developed discourse, or especially discourse around historically marginalized folks, for example. And so the way Marcuse is read, like I think he has a lot of richness to offer us right now. I want to position him, mostly in the 1960s here, because as we have the date here, 1965. But it'll be obvious, I think, at times where I pop out into more recent stuff that he is fruitful for thinking with us right now, whether or not, of course, whether or not we agree with him or any of these critical theorists, right? Um, uh, yeah, I think let's just dig in here. He doesn't have one more other thing. He doesn't have the language of neoliberalism yet. He's not using that term. But I feel like a lot of the things that he is saying in this essay um, precede that moment. And of course, in economic terms, right? I mean, neoliberalism had been theorized since the late 1930s, according to Wendy Brown. But it's really after the early 1970s, after the shift away from the gold standard to finance capital, um, after France comes and removes its gold from the United States as a kind of protest to the way that the United States is handling the Vietnam War. Um, so I think that you will hear a lot of resonance, hopefully, if you've been reading along with us, a lot of resonance with people talking about neoliberalism, but he's not going to be talking about that. You will also hear, of course, resonance with Hegel, because Marcuse did his doctoral work on Hegel. Of course, there's the Freud stuff as well in here. So he's synthesizing a lot of different things. There will be some returns obliquely, at least, to concepts that Carl Schmitt have brought up in political theology. So that'll be an interesting thing to look at as well. This beginning paragraph, like a way I think for students to find a way into this essay, though, is to go back to what we think about doing critical theory is. Like, what does it do? It tries to have like a finger on the pulse of the current times. It often turns for an explanation for current times towards material, historical, or economic analyses. It is intentionally looking in its assessment of a current crisis for a way to divert something that would push us towards totalitarian society. So implicitly, there's a kind of agenda there, right? That there's like a moment of a politics of pause against a fascist accelerationism, for example. Um, we in critical theory tend towards social analysis over individual analysis. And that major part of critical theory, since the early Frankfurt School in the 1920s, is a way of addressing something absent in purely Marxian analyses. There must be an assessment not only of society at large, which Marx tries to do with his assessment of the proletarian, right, as this new class that's coming up, but what Marx is not able to give an account of is culture, and especially mass society, the development of new technology, whether it's the radio or the television or the atom bomb. Things have shifted by Marcuse's time, and there still must be a social analysis. He's going to have a lot of dialogue in this essay. Pay attention to the way he's using John Stuart Mill. We are not reading Mill in this class, but Mill is a classic liberal philosopher. So John Stuart Mill stands for liberalism here, and Marcuse is going to say some things about that. So as a way in here, he's doing a Marxian move in the sense that Marx, in the manifesto, when we read that, he gave an account of bourgeois society as initially being a moment of liberation, right? The breakdown of the feudal system is a good thing for Marx. It's progressive in a sense, but it sets up a new dialectic because Marx is, of course, reading in terms of a dialectical thinking that he inherits from Hegel. He wants to turn it towards material, concrete things like economy instead of something like the phenomenology of spirit. In any case, what Marx is saying, and later philosophers, not just in the Marxian variety, but including people like John Stuart Mill, broadly speaking, 19th century philosophy is trying to deal with some notion of society or groups, right? As opposed to Enlightenment-centered focus on individualism and the individual's capability of rationality. That alone doesn't give us enough of a picture, not according to Marx, not according to the critical theorists, and certainly not according to Marcuse as well. So, but liberalism and what becomes the positivistic thinking that Carl Schmitt hates so much is taking Enlightenment-centered rationality and running with it. And that, according to the right-wing Schmittian view, is what deteriorates the notion of sovereignty and makes it so that we have no decisions or no decider and so in the post-World War I moment where there's all this mass destruction, what he's lamenting and calling for is a decider. He actually thinks that it will be a more peaceful way of doing things, but of course, anybody with liberal thinking or more further left thinking sees this as the return of oppression, right? And so Marcuse is going to do that. So the way you want to think about Marcuse going into this essay is knowing that he's a critical theorist, right? That he has a particular way of thinking and reading history and a particular ethical impulse, we might say, to like give an assessment of the current moment. And in that, it's going to be a way of forestalling a kind of impulse, a mass impulse in the 20th century towards totalitarianism that he sees as in liberal society in the United States, he sees the totalitarian impulses as a threat, even in the 1960s, right? So again, is this the baggage of somebody who comes from Germany where he's already seen a liberal society go the route of fascism? Or national with Nazism or not National Socialism? Or is he right on track with his assessment? That's something that we're going to have to think about and you're going to have to decide on your own. So let's look at the first paragraph here. He says, this essay examines the idea of tolerance in our advanced industrial society. Tolerance, okay. The conclusion reached, so he's going to tell us right from the beginning, the conclusion reached is that the realization of the objective of tolerance would call for intolerance towards prevailing policies, attitudes, opinions, and the extension of tolerance towards policies attitudes and opinions which are outlawed or suppressed. What we is saying is that we need to be tolerant of things that are subversive, that are outlawed, suppressed. We should be intolerant of the status quo state of things. In other words, he says, today, in 1965, tolerance appears again as what it was as its origins at the beginning of the modern period, a partisan goal, a subversive, liberating notion and practice. Conversely, though, what is proclaimed and practiced as tolerance today is in many of its most effective manifestations serving the cause of oppression. So there are kind of two ways of looking at tolerance here, which is a classic liberal value, right, that he's calling into question. He says that the necessity today, the tolerance that we want to be open to, is the tolerance of the subversive against the status quo. That's what it has always been within the liberal tradition. But in the 20th century here, it has been cast by mass society and consumer society as something else. This is a big part of Marcuse's thinking. It's in line with Adorno and Horkheimer and their critique of mass society and mass culture, although he's not taking that route. It's in line with Walter Benjamin and his aesthetic focus, and aesthetics will become a big part of Marcuse's project and what he calls in a later essay the aesthetic dimension. So it's about our ability to sense things. It's not just art, it's the sensibility of things in the world. Excuse me. So he's clearly, hopefully you're seeing now, like this is just from reading all of these authors, kind of what critical theory is and what it's doing. I've been trying to give you bullet points for it, but he's right in line with a genre or a discourse that we would call critical theory. Here, I'm going to skip down. I've got a lot of highlights here. He says the author, or Marcuse, is fully aware that at present no power, no authority, no government exists which would translate liberating tolerance into practice. So he's going to say that whether we're in the Soviet Union or whether we're in the United States in 1965, both governments have, and all governments have, repressive qualities. They don't tolerate the kind of things that we want tolerance to do, which is to allow the subversive to come to the present. He says then tolerance is an end in itself. The elimination of violence and the reduction of suppression to the extent required for protecting man and animals from cruelty and aggression are preconditions for the creation of a humane society. Notice how he includes protection of man and animals from cruelty in there. I think that's an innovative part of his thinking, although we're not dealing with human-animal distinction so much in this talk. Such a society, he says, does not yet exist. We don't live in a truly free society anywhere in the world, right? And especially in 1965. So he says, progress towards this type of society is perhaps more than before arrested by violence and suppression on a global scale. He's almost assessing that the globe, he's not using the term globalization, which kind of shows up in the early 70s as well, but he's foreshadowing that discussion in a sense, right? By saying almost like that the world has swung right in his time. He says, as deterrence against nuclear war, as police action against subversion, as technical aid in the fight against imperialism and communism, as methods of pacification in neo-colonial massacres, violence and suppression are promulgated, practiced, and defended by democratic and authoritarian governments alike. And the people subjected to these governments are educated to sustain such practices as necessary for the preservation of the status quo. tolerance is extended to policies, conditions, and modes of behavior which should not be tolerated because they are impeding, if not destroying, the chances of creating an existence without fear and misery. So, what is happening? And so, think about his moment. Again, contextualized readings, 1965. He's thinking about the conflicts in Vietnam. He's thinking about the domino theory, the idea that US foreign policy must go and um, uh, intervene in different places in the world to prevent one country from becoming communist and then it becoming a domino effect around the world. He is thinking about nuclear war, the possibilities of nuclear war, and the buildup of the arms race during the Cold War, right? That we build bigger bombs to try and create peace. It's like it's a contradiction in logic, right? Like that we build more and more mass destruction in order for peace, right? Police violence against subversion, technical aid in the fight against imperialism as methods of pacification, neo-colonial massacres. So we've had the post-colonial movements throughout Africa, especially Africa, but also we could go back to India in 1948. Um, so all over the world, all sorts of stuff happening in South America, sorts of stuff happening in Southeast Asia at the time. And so he's saying that what happens is that like the US public, and which is mostly in his mind because he's living here at the moment, is trained and educated to think that all of these interventions by a so-called democratic society are good, right? And so we should tolerate the evil of creating bigger nuclear weapons because what it's going to do is save us against the communists, something like that. But he says that authoritarian governments are doing the same sort of thing as well, right? So this isn't just something that democratic societies do or authoritarian societies do. They both do it. But the problem is through the education of the masses, through a kind of propaganda work, that we don't question that. We tolerate increased violence. But what really, if we think about tolerance from its classical liberal value, um, we should not be tolerating those things, and because they're actually destroying the possibility of human freedom, right? So he says this sort of tolerance, the tolerance of supporting like Robert McNamara and the systems theory that came into policies in the war in Vietnam that thought only in terms of mass numbers of a population and thought that we could napalm or do different things and we wouldn't have to worry, like doesn't take into account any kind of like civilian um casualties or things like that. The idea is kind of one similar to a later policy that US military, if you remember Donald Rumsfeld from Iraq and Afghanistan, calling it shock and awe, that we will go in with our superior technology and missiles and our precision military tactics, and we will so awe this much more impoverished part of the world that this will be over and done with really quickly. Of course, that's not what happened in Iraq and Afghanistan. That's not what happened in Vietnam either. But McNamara was like the systems theory is a really good example of instrumental reason. Um, so that's something he's aware of. Kissinger's policies as well, we could throw in there, but I'm not going to delve down that road right now. So he says this sort of tolerance, the tolerance of mass violence, nuclear weapons, all of that sort of stuff, strengthens the tyranny of the majority against which authentic liberals protest because of the effectiveness of 20th century propaganda and indoctrination. It's created something that appears to be democratic, which is a kind of ignorant mass of people, and that call for something like freedom that is a different kind of freedom than at the early start of the liberal period, right? So again, he's not necessarily Marxist, but he's like, but he's drawing on that Marxian historical material way of viewing history. So the next highlighted section here, he says tolerance toward that which is radically evil now appears as good because it serves as the cohesion of the whole on the road to affluence or more affluence. The toleration of the systematic moralization of children and adults alike by publicity and propaganda, the release of destructiveness and aggressive driving, the recruitment for and training of special forces, the impotent and benevolent tolerance toward outright deception in merchandising, waste, and planned obsolescence are not distortions and aberrations. They are the essence of a system which fosters tolerance as a means for perpetuating the struggle for existence and suppressing the alternatives. Great book by John Kenneth Galbraith, The Affluent Society, right? This is his description of 1950s and 60s economic types of policy, especially in the United States. If you go back to the period, you can watch on YouTube the debates between Khrushchev and Richard Nixon, well before Nixon is a president, where Nixon is trying to show that like liberal society has these great washer machines and all sorts of new appliances that have all been developed actually because of the earlier war machine, all of the knowledge that came in from World War II is now being applied to the domestic sphere and creating all these new appliances. Whereas Soviet Russia doesn't have those kinds of nice amenities of life, right? So the affluent society, the US is doing really well in its economic booming. We could look at John F. Kennedy and his fascination with special forces here as well, being trained. We can think of even James Bond novels, I think you could throw into this particular period, where there becomes a sort of fascination with spies. Um, all of this is like promoted as something that we should like think of as good and heroic and all this sort of stuff, but that actually creates a tolerance for the buildup of Cold War, which creates violence on a mass sort of scale, right? So it ends up being part of a propaganda system that habituates us to to thinking that this stuff is cool. The authorities in education and psychology are vociferous against increased juvenile delinquency. So think about um, 1950s motorcycle gangs or something like this, right? Or the mods and rockers of the 1960s, right? We see this whole movement in psychology that we're hearing about the problems of youth, but like we're not taking into account that these youth are growing up in a time where they like have like nuclear fallout drills where they're hiding under desks, right? Like where like when you tell the youth that the future is not that there is no future, isn't it sort of natural that they're going to act out, right? In the same way that we might talk in the 21st century about climate fatigue, right? Like that the environment is being destroyed. No real governmental powers in the world really take this seriously enough to do anything about it, at least not in the time that it's going to take in this kind of like apocalyptic ticking time towards which the warming of the globe are going to bring in all, even worse catastrophes, environmental catastrophes that already exist, right? So instead, so we obsess about like domestic society, the problems with the youth, but we don't have the kind of critical reflection to be like, why would they be acting this way? Did we do anything to make that happen? Like to make this sort of situation happen? And so we get caught in this like discussion of like, oh, the youth, or oh, blah 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 blah, because we're not able to have a critical discussion of the ways that we are tolerating things that should not be tolerated. So he refers explicitly to his dialectical method here. He says, according to a dialectical proposition, it is the whole, which it determines the truth, not in the sense that the whole is prior to prior or superior to its parts, but in the sense that its structure and function determine every particular condition and relation. Thus, within a repressive society, even the progressive movements threaten to turn into the opposite to the degree to which they accept the rules of the game. To take a most controversial case, the exercise of political rights, such as voting, letter writing to the press, to senators, etc., protest demonstrations with a priori renunciation of counterviolence. In a society of total administration, this serves to strengthen this administration by testifying to the existence of democratic liberties, which in reality have changed their content and lost their effectiveness. You can hear this theme in the 1960s as a tension between what emerges as the Black Panther Party. Remember, Angela Davis is one of Marcuse's students. They are willing to arm themselves against the government. They're willing to defend themselves. Malcolm X, we could put over in that category too, as opposed to someone like Martin Luther King Jr. And I wouldn't say, there is a late 60s among the radical left, there's a lot of critique, I will say, of Martin Luther King Jr.'s pacifism. Uh, um, I wouldn't exactly put Marcuse in that category yet because of some of the things he says down below in the essay about when and why we use nonviolent protest. And he says that if you're marginalized enough, if you're oppressed enough, and that's the only thing that you can do, then that becomes a necessary method. Um, but the question, the broader question then is that the only way that we should be dealing with things right now? And so in some sense, you can understand why a younger person like Abby Hoffman, who's a big protest movement student of in psychedelic movement, I would say, student of Marcuse here, and we can see why people will be super interested in what he's saying here. He says tolerance itself stands subject to overriding criteria. Its range and its limits cannot be defined in terms of the respective society. In other words, limits cannot be defined in terms, oh, sorry, in other words, tolerance is an end in itself only when it is truly universal, practiced by the rulers as well as the ruled, by the lords as well as by the peasants, by the sheriffs as well as by the victims, and such universal tolerance is possible only when no real or alleged enemy requires, in the national interest, the education and training of people in military violence and destruction. There is a way that tolerance in Marcuse's society, in industrial society, capitalist society, advanced capitalist society, we might say, where we train youth, where the youth want to go into the army. They want to become really good at being able to impose violence on other people, whether it's the army or becoming a ninja martial arts expert, whatever you want to call it. Um, uh, that uses the idea of tolerance as a kind of universal here. So, right, so this is a problem that Marcuse is seeing within dialectical thinking, because on the one hand, like what is liberating for one period in history becomes the status quo later on, right? And so the perception has changed. So on the one hand, liberalism has embraced a value of tolerance, but that valuing of tolerance has become participatory in the status quo society, and in doing so, it presents itself as like we should just tolerate everything, right, as a kind of universal. And he's going to qualify that a little bit later. He's going to say that no, that's a distortion of what actually liberal tolerance was at the beginning of um, liberalism and the overthrowing of feudal society. He says, in such a society, tolerance is de facto limited on the dual ground of legalized violence or suppression of armed forces, guards of all sorts, and of the privileged position held by the predominant interests in their connections. So what really is sort of happening in this society that claims to have universal tolerance, but doesn't, no society has that kind of freedom today. Um, he says that what is tolerated is violence by police, prison guards, and and especially new corporations, right? Big business, capitalist owners, their connections, a dominant economic elite in society. All of those things could be fall under those categories. So he says these background limitations of tolerance are normally prior to the explicit and judicial limitations as defined by the courts, customs, governments, etc. For example, clear and present danger to national security heresy. He's going to come back to that theme, that quote, clear and present danger. He says, within the framework social of such a social structure, tolerance can be safely practiced and proclaimed, but it exists in two ways. He says the first way is going to be passive toleration of entrenched and established attitudes and ideas, even if their damaging effect on man and nature is evident. Again, nuclear wars, the atomic bomb, right? We tolerate the existence of nuclear weapons, even though we know that they're unethical, they're wrong, they potentially destroy all species on the planet. The second form here is active or official tolerance granted to the right as well as to the left. So he, at this point in the essay, is saying that this universalized, in quotes, notion of tolerance knows no political boundaries. It is what I call in my book the political theological vortex, where we don't know the distinction between left and right. He says the act of official tolerance granted to the right as well as to the left, to movements of aggression as well as to movements of peace, to the party of hate as well as to that of humanity. I call this nonpartisan tolerance abstract or pure inasmuch as it refrains from taking sides, but in doing so, it actually protects the already established machinery of discrimination. What he's saying, and this is a way to bring this into the present, is he's going to start talking about freedom of speech here. He's going to say that in this kind of universalized notion of tolerance, again, universalized in quotes, um, that says that somebody who says like, well, I think that all Jewish people should die or something, and so that perspective should be tolerated. I mean, like I have the right to my own opinion. That sort of like everybody has their right to their own opinions of things, and that's just my belief or something like we've like I hear students make these kinds of not hopefully not that particular example, but that kind of completely subjectivized uh, notion of belief that must be tolerated, even though it means the extermination or the eradication of other humans on the planet, for example, right? Um, uh, that is what he's going to say is this part of the problem of this abstract and pure notion of tolerance, again in quotes there. He says the tolerance which enlarged the range and content of freedom was always partisan. From back in early liberalism, he says, like freedom, the liberal movement is partisan in the sense that it wants people to be free and liberated. Like, um, so if we are claiming that like my like National Socialist agenda, which is premised on the destruction of an entire group of people or groups of peoples, if we were include Romani people or Sinti people in there as well. If we're claiming that that gets to be a political perspective, just like any other one, and gets to be just entertained in this abstract way, as our affluent society does, because when we listen to that and we think like, oh, well, yeah, corporations are people too, and corporations just get to they might have their own belief system, right? And if that's discriminatory against other people or exclusive, that's their right, because their corporations are persons, and people who are violent people have their belief systems just like anybody else. Um, the tolerance, he says, which enlarged the range and content of freedom, was always partisan, intolerant towards the protagonists of the repressive status quo. The issue was only the degree and extent of intolerance. In the firmly established liberal society of England and the United States, freedom of speech and assembly was granted. This is back in the 1700s, right? Was granted to the radical enemies of society, provided they did not make the transition from word to deed, from speech to action. Um, so again, like how we're thinking about censorship is coming in here, and this should resonate with recent discussions in university culture, especially in the 21st century, right? Relying on the effective background limitations imposed by its class structure, the society seems to practice general tolerance, but liberalist theory had already placed an important condition on tolerance. It was to apply only to human beings in the maturity of their faculties. And that is a quote. He's talking, now he turns to John Stuart Mill, classic liberal theorist, right? I have already mentioned this in previous contextualized readings, but it bears repeating here. Liberals, and the way I frame this is their intentional genocide towards indigenous peoples, right? Because they don't believe that you can just be an indigenous person in a community and come to Congress and talk and have a civilized discussion. You must go through a civilizing process, a kind of educational formation, in order to be granted the rational rights of liberty in classic liberal thought here. So John Stuart Mill, he says, does not only speak of children and minors, he elaborates, quote, this is John Stuart Mill: liberty as a principle has no application to any state of things anterior to the time when mankind and have become capable of being improved by free and equal discussion. But there's a formation process in order to get into free and equal discussion. He says, anterior to that time, men may still be barbarians, and despotism is the legitimate mode of government in dealing with the barbarians, provided the end be their improvement and the means justified by actually effecting that end. Again, the way it's framed is like this, like language of self-improvement, of education, very 19th century kind of ideals of universal education. But we know now in the United States, for example, that enforced boarding school systems on indigenous people, for their improvement, were inherently genocidal. That's not what Marcuse is taking into account for here. And so I'm going to point that out as a possible flaw here, although that's not exactly where Marcuse's agenda is here. He's just trying to cover what classical liberal thought does. And his point is to say that liberation in classical liberal theory is not this abstract universal type of thing. It has an agenda to be liberating of mankind. African American thought more recently, and I would say, or radical Black thought, has taken up a critique of this human that is embedded within liberalism. So right here, it was to apply only to human beings in the maturity of their faculties, both indigenous but I would say especially, I just hear it more, or maybe I've just read a little bit more recently in radical Black thinking, that like the challenge is to that notion of the human, the habituated human that is completely Eurocentric from their perspective, right? And so when that kind of Eurocentric notion of the human is presented as a universal and cast onto indigenous peoples of the world, that becomes colonialism and domination, right? That it is completely anti-liberal, and anti-progressive, but it's going to be a debate. It's going to be a conflict within different, like how left you are. People on the right, in this sense, like the right-wing policies in the 19th century towards Native American peoples are like, the line "nits kill lice," or sorry, Nits Make Lice, from Shivington in the Sand Creek Massacre here in Colorado, where I live. They just don't care about wiping people out or not wiping, like just like wipe people out because they believe, like Kant and Hume, that people who don't aren't cultured in the way that they think culture should be, um, are holding back humanity. So we've got it like that impulse, which we can see in Hitler in the final solution, is clearly there in the policies of 19th century United States. And Frank Whitman, right? I think Frank Q. Whitman has a book called Hitler's American Model. He's not the only person to do this or the first person to do this, but I think it's a University of Princeton Press book. People tend not to believe Native American people when they make these kinds of arguments, so I'm citing that one there. They think that they charge Native people as essentializing themselves, romanticizing themselves, all sorts of racist things. That get applied, or they're just like playing the so-called race card. um, uh, Back to Marcuse's essay here, then he says, um, uh, in this moment that like there's no time anterior to that time, men still may be barbarians, and despotism is a legitimate mode of government in dealing with barbarians, provided the end be their improvement and the means justified by actually affecting that end. So the soft policy of here of the liberals would be that the indigenous peoples need to be educated and culturally formed to align. Now, implicit behind that, and even in John Stuart Mill, is Christianity as well, too. So Christianity is implicitly the most rational form of religion, even in its secularized form. So there's that whole part of discussion. It's just not where Marcuse is going with this. So he says Mill's often quoted words have a less familiar implication on which their meaning depends, the internal connection between liberty and truth. So he takes this different angle here to distinguish liberty and truth. There is a sense in which truth is the end of liberty, and liberty must be defined and confined by truth. Now, what sense can liberty be for truth of sake for the sake of truth? Liberty is self-determination, autonomy. This is almost a tautology, but a tautology which results from the whole series of synthetic judgments. What he means there is synthetic judgments are going to be of that formation process, that educational cultivating, especially vertical cultivating process that we get through the synthetic judgments that we get through a whole process of self-reflection. He says it stipulates the abilities to determine one's own life, to be able to determine what to do and what not to do, what to suffer and what not. But the subject of this autonomy is never the contingent private individual as that which he actually is or happens to be. It is rather the individual as a human being who is capable of being free with others. And this is true because in abstract tolerance, it's just all about me and how do I survive? How do I get ahead? Right? Screw everybody in power. I'm just trying to protect my family. These kinds of rationales that we hear, especially by disenfranchised people, right? Who buy into an ideology of abstract freedom and don't uh, um, I can't rely on society. I just need to retreat to myself in order to just like survive, right? That is the condition that I think a lot of people in the United States have, and a lot of people who identify as being on the right, for example, I think buy into that. But what Marcuse is saying is that within classical liberalism, it's partisan. It's not just individual. It is an individual that is within part of a species, right? Is it in a part of a larger group, right? Called humanity here. And they can update it and say like, well, our previous Eurocentric notions of humanity were flawed by definition, but we can take account of that sort of thing right now. So that's what a progressive liberal stance might be. Um, uh, and it wouldn't be quite progressive enough for somebody who is really interested in radical black thought, for example. We'll get into that a little bit later, but you can maybe hear the formation of what the critique that critical race theory will give, which is to say that racism is even embedded in liberalism here as well. It's not being expressed overtly, but it's implied in here. Um, and so that's the kind of racism that we need to take account of in critical race theory, as opposed to the progressive liberal. Uh, he says, and the problem of making possible such a harmony between every individual and liberty and the other is not that of finding a compromise between competitors or between freedom and law, between general and individual interests, common and private welfare in an established society, but of creating the society in which man is no longer enslaved by institutions which vitiate self-determination from the beginning. It shouldn't be only about you trying to survive, right? It shouldn't be about like your own income. It shouldn't be that you're a bad person because you don't make enough money in a society that's like set up for your demise, is what he's saying. Um, but in order to like do the critical work, we do have to step outside of ourselves. So he says, uh, in other words, freedom is still to be created, even for the freest of existing societies, and the direction in which it must be sought and the institutional and cultural changes which may help to attain that goal are, at least in developed civilization, comprehensible. That is to say, they can be identified and projected on the basis of experience by human reason. So here he's saying, we're not giving up on all enlightenment thought. We're not saying like nobody be reasonable anymore. Let's throw like reason out the window. He's saying no, that reason needs to be fused with the attention towards society at large. He does think that liberal society has gives us a kind of opening to seeing what the potential better society might be, in the sense that it's comprehensible, but he's saying that we're not there yet. In that sense, I think that we could label Marcuse's thinking here as progressivist. It's Hegelian progressivism as well, in a certain sense, although not necessarily Christian in the ways that Hegel is implicitly Christian, but you could argue with me on that, and that's maybe a very current discussion in critical theory, is to the extent which these secularly Jewish thinkers like Marcuse or Hannah Arendt buy into an implicitly Euro-Christian fantasy structure. That's just a open for debate. It kind of exceeds where we're at for contextualized reading, but I wanted to mention it. So he then moves to theory and practice, and he's talking about true and false situations. And he's says, I'm skipping down a little bit here. He says, freedom is liberation, a specific historical process in theory and practice. And as such, it has its right and wrong, its truth and falsehood. This is important to think of because we often talk today about a post-truth society. For Marcuse, no, we don't throw out rationality. We don't throw out our ability to have a criteria of what is right and wrong, but we have to see freedom and liberation in a dialectical process that is moving through history, right? So it is not fully formed all the time, but what truth is, and this is very Hegelian for him, what truth is the recognition of the entire process itself. It's not one particular little fragment of it. He says the uncertainty of chance in this distinction does not cancel the historical objectivity. That's what he means by objectivity. He means the whole process that can be seen, right? It's not just like the book that's on the table in front of me. He says, but it necessitates freedom of thought and expression as preconditions of finding the way to freedom. It necessitates tolerance. However, this tolerance cannot be indiscriminate and equal with respect to the contents of expression, neither in word nor in deed. It cannot protect false words and wrong deeds, which demonstrate that they contradict and counteract the possibilities of liberation. Like think about like climate change deniers or something like this, right? He would say like, no, you cannot just like say just choose conveniently not to believe in some sort of scientific truth, right? We can question it though, and we should question it, but there's a certain sort of moment where we don't where we have to sort of take the truth. And that's the and keep going with it. But reacting in a sense that that you're just going to deny all of the evidence in a particular area is not something that should be tolerated in the way that we tolerate um, uh, someone else's religious beliefs or that we tolerate someone else's cultural beliefs because they are also part of this shared humanity type of thing. Because the climate change denier is actually doing something that's in the interests of oil companies or big extractive industries that are capitalizing on a world that we all share, right? We all humans share, but only a few select humans get to capitalize on the destruction of the world itself, right? So that's just bringing another sort of more current example here. He says such indiscriminate tolerance, if we're just saying like, oh, well, the climate change deniers, it's just their perspective. Um, Such indiscriminate tolerance is justified in harmless debates, in conversation, in academic discussion. It is indispensable in the scientific enterprise, in private religion. But society cannot be indiscriminate where the pacification of existence, where freedom and happiness themselves are at stake. Here, certain things cannot be said, certain ideas cannot be expressed, certain policies cannot be proposed, certain behavior cannot be permitted without making tolerance an instrument for the continuation of servitude. So, yes, when I'm talking to my high school students who mainly grow up in an affluent suburb, they may, and a very Christian one at that, they may say all sorts of things in my ethics class that are like kind of ethically suspect at times, but they're working out their thinking, right? It's okay in that particular setting to have a little bit more indiscriminate tolerance because we're letting students do some reflective work. We shouldn't leave them in that particular territory, and but this is like kind of classic liberal education. We allow people to experiment a little bit, right? We have units where people, our students read Animal Farm or they read George Orwell's 1984 or something like that, right? It's like because we're exposing them to the problems and conditions of society. But that doesn't mean that US Congress should act in the way that my high school ethics classroom operates in terms of things, right? And so this it heightens for, I think, Marcuse, the sense of the political as a particular kind of register, in the Aristotelian sense of the political as being deliberative rhetoric about making decisions about the future, right? So he then goes into the danger of destructive tolerance. He refers to Baudelaire and art, and he says this is like the benevolent neutrality towards art. Again, this has some echoes with Walter Benjamin, where he says that art for art's sake is the thing that is the harbinger of fascism or totalitarianism, because that art for art's sake is the same thing as that kind of pure tolerance that just says to tolerate everything. Or when students want to be uncritical and they're just like, I just don't judge. I just don't judge. Just don't judge anything. It's like, yeah, we can't really live in that realm either. Um, so he says here, art stands against history, withstands history, which has been the history of oppression. For art subjects reality to laws other than the established ones. to the laws of the form, capital F, which creates a different reality, negation of the established one, even where art depicts the established reality. But in its struggle with history, the art subjects itself to history. History enters the definition of art and enters into the distinction between art and pseudo art. Thus, it happens that what was once art becomes pseudo art. I've mentioned this essay a few times in this course, just obliquely, but this is very much resonant with Vasily Kandinsky, the painter's essay from earlier in the 20th century called Concerning the Spiritual and Art, that sometimes art, like earlier art movements, can become dead. Um, so Marcuse says, thus it happens that what was once art becomes pseudo art. Previous forms, styles, and qualities, previous modes of protest and refusal cannot be recaptured in or against a different society. They're contextualized. He's not saying that we should never look at past art or we should trash it all or something like that. But he says, and he uses Dostoevsky as a point. He says that we don't necessarily read that particular work from that time as being having the liberatory potential that a current work that's challenging the ways that we might think about how society is. So this is a kind of progressive view of art, of capital A art and its function in society. He embraces a kind of secularized notion of art. And this is like a little bit more of an advancement, I would say, in terms of the pessimism that Walter Benjamin has in his essay, Art in the Work in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction. But it's also a kind of embracing. He doesn't refer to Benjamin here, but he does see Benjamin's project of doing art criticism as not the bourgeois art criticism of the past. He says, no, actually engaging with aesthetic products and process is an activity that we can engage in that will help us critique our current time. It's a good zone for which to think about things. So he's embraced the cultural analysis movement of both Adorno and Horkheimer and of Benjamin. He refers to Edgar Wind, Art and Anarchy, which is an interesting book in its own right, but I'm not going to give coverage of it here. I think I do mention it in my book, but it's been a while since I've read Vin's book. He says tolerance of free speech is the way of improvement, of progress and liberation, not because there's no objective truth, and improvement must necessarily be a compromise between a variety of opinions, but because there is an objective truth in which can be discovered, ascertained only in learning and comprehending that which is and that which can be and ought to be done for the sake of improving the lot of mankind. So he's embracing classic liberalism here, right? The common and historical ought is not immediately evident at hand. It has to be uncovered by cutting through or splitting or breaking asunder, discutio, discussion, right? The given material, separating right and wrong, good and bad, correct and incorrect. The subject whose improvement depends on a progressive historical practice is each man as man, and this universality is reflected in that of the discussion, which a priori does not exclude any group or individual, but even the all-inclusive character of liberalist tolerance was, at least in theory, based on the proposition that men were potential individuals who could learn to hear and see and feel by themselves, to develop their own thoughts, to grasp their true interests and rights and capabilities, also against established authority and opinion. You should want to improve yourself. You have the capability to improve yourself. What should not be tolerated is just like, I can't even understand what you're saying, you critical theorists. Like you can't understand a goddamn word. You use such a big vocabulary. Like I'm going to retreat to my anti-intellectual area and like life and stick my head in the sand, right? Because I don't want to have to think about this sort of stuff because it's difficult, because it's hard, or because my particular class or racial or gender privilege means I don't have to care about the rest of the world, right? That's the kind of attitude that Marcuse is saying we can't really tolerate. Because liberal tolerance was based on the idea of an active individual who's capable of and does learn in society. So he says this was the rationale of free speech and assembly. Um, Universal toleration becomes questionable when its rationale no longer prevails, when tolerance is questionable. Sorry, universal toleration becomes questionable when its rationale no longer prevails, when tolerance is administered to manipulated and indoctrinated individuals who parrot as their own the opinions of the masters, for whom heteronomy has become autonomy. We say, oh, yeah, you just get, everybody gets to have their own opinion. Everybody's different from everybody else. And that's what makes you the individual that you are, right? He says the telos of tolerance is truth. It's clear from the historical record that the authentic spokesman of tolerance had more and other truth in mind than that of the propositional logic of the academic theory. Again, that's a little smack towards um, analytic philosophy, which is the current rage when he's writing this in American universities, especially, is propositional and symbolic logic. And he's Hegelian, so he's a continental philosopher, and so he wants to take history into account as well. And then he turns again to John Stuart Mill, interestingly, instead of someone like Hegel, because he's talking about the liberal tradition here. So he says John Stuart Mill speaks of the truth which is persecuted in history and which does not triumph over persecution by the virtue of its inherent power, which in fact has no inherent power against the dungeon and the stake. And he enumerates the truths which were cruelly and successfully liquidated in the dungeons and at the stake. So he's talking about suppressed groups here, um, uh, of different folks throughout history. He says tolerance is first and foremost for the sake of the heretics, the historical road toward humanitas, like this is classic like Euro-Christian humanism, appears as heresy, um, uh, target of persecution by the powers that be. Heresy by itself, however, is no token of truth. You don't just get to be heretical and claim like I'm my own person. I dance to the beat of my own drum. Like I'm a free thinker. That's one of the ones that recently comes up. I don't have to do anything anybody else says. That kind of stuff. It's like, no, but there is within liberal society the idea that we tolerate them somebody who has made an argument. And so this is but we with the end towards liberating humanity as a whole, not towards just sticking your head in a different kind of hole. Criterion of progress, he says, in freedom, according to which Mill judges these movements, is the Reformation, capital R Reformation. So again, that political theological strain is behind this. I cover some of that in my book, and there's some nice essay in a Telos journal from years back now. It's a whole journal. I can't remember the volume number, but it's dedicated to Marcuse. And there's some really nice essays in that particular um, uh, um, issue of the journal. So I'm going to skip down here a little bit. And he gets to this moment in the essay where he's asking questions. So it's like he's very aware. It's like he's like there's a tension here, right? There's a tension between like, yes, we need to tolerate different people's opinions, but this does not mean tolerating people's opinions who believe in this just in illiberalism or in the destruction of other groups, as being just as valuable as any other kind as something that's trying to an argument that's trying to liberate humanity altogether, right, from oppression. So he says, in this this series of questions here, does this clinch the case for the indiscriminate pure tolerance? Are there historical conditions in which such toleration impedes liberation and multiplies victims who are sacrificed to the status quo? He's thinking of the Nazis, right? The Nazis claim freedom and liberation, but the sacrificed victims are the Jews, right? Can the indiscriminate guarantee of political rights and liberties be repressive? Can such tolerance serve to contain the qualitative social change? Again, he's looking back, he's thinking about his experience in Europe, the experience of National Socialism, and the way that liberalism helped them come into power against the communists and opened the door. Their tolerance of the Weimar Republic opened the door to the intolerance of Nazism, right? So he's looking for where that possibility might be in existence for his own current time in the 1960s in the United States. So he says he's going to shift discussion here. I'm going to propose a shift in the focus of my essay right now. It's going to be concerned not only with and not primarily with tolerance towards radical extremes, minorities, subversives, etc., but rather with tolerance toward majorities, toward official and public opinion, toward the established protectors of freedom. In this case, the discussion can have as a frame of reference only a democratic society in which the people as individuals, as members of political and other organizations participate in the making, sustaining, and changing of policies. In an authoritarian society, the people do not tolerate, they suffer established policies. So he's saying, I'm basically writing and talking in the United States right now. What I am about to say does not apply to a totalitarian regime somewhere else in the world. It's only within the potential working space of the liberal society in which I live that we can have this particular discussion. He also says here, he makes the qualifier. He says, I realize that there are marginalized minority groups. I am not going to be focusing on the inclusion of them right now. So that's something that maybe happens later on in the 20th century in academic discourse that's very present right now. But what he's saying in his essay at this particular moment is that he's going to turn his attention for the second half of the essay towards a mass society that has been diluted by propaganda of people who are in power, so that they tolerate massive up, like the building of mass arms and nuclear weapons, the building of military industrial complex, the invasion of different countries around the rest of the world in the name of freedom, right? So he says, under a system of constitutionally guaranteed and generally without too many and too glaring exceptions, practice civil rights and liberties, opposition and dissent are tolerated unless they issue in violence and or in exhortation to organization of violent subversion. In liberal society, we allow people to protest. We allow people to have different ideas and to express those different ideas. If they move from theory into practice, and that practice is violence or destructive to society, then that's where they become intolerant, right? The underlying assumption is that the established society is free, though, and that any improvement, even a change in the social structure and social values, would come about in the normal discourse, in the normal course of events, prepared, defined, and tested in free and equal discussion on the open marketplace of ideas and goods. Now, in recalling John Stuart Mill's passage, so that's liberalism, right? That's just class. That's what we think of generally as liberal society: freedom of speech, freedom of protest, freedom of expression. All of these things are good things in theory. But he says when we have that approach and the people who are in power are oppressive, they've created a kind of frame around us where we're just sort of talking about our freedoms abstractly, and while all at the same time supporting the system, saying like, well, at least here I have the freedom to think in this particular way, even though I'm being completely oppressed economically by the powers that be, and whether they're in government or whether they're in capitalist industry or something. So he says, now in recalling John Stuart Mill's passage, I drew attention to the premise hidden in this assumption. Free and equal discussion can fulfill a function attributed to it only if it is rational expression, and development of independent thinking free from indoctrination, manipulation, and extraneous authority. So he returns back to that. And so he needs to direct his discourse for to us to have that partisan version of liberation in mind, and toleration in mind. That it is the toleration of voices that move us towards a potentially more liberated society, not towards one that is more of a repressive society. Um, uh, he says here down here, by the same token, those minorities which strive for a change of the whole itself under optimal conditions will, which rarely prevail, will be left free to deliberate and discuss, to speak and to assemble, and will be left harmless and helpless in the face of the overwhelming majority which militates against qualitative social change. This majority is firmly grounded in the increasing satisfaction of needs and technological and mental coordination, which testify to the general helplessness of radical groups in a well-functioning society. Again, he's returned to the idea of the affluent society. He's saying that like we get consumer society is telling us that we're getting all of our basic needs met and even exceedingly met, even though minorities in our society are having to protest, such as with marches on Washington with Martin Luther King Jr. So race and that sort of issue is showing up here as well. He's saying that what becomes hard is like that these people are protesting with a real sort of sense of moving towards a more liberated society, but the majority of society cannot hear their cries, right? Because they are being told that because they have a, you know, they make a good income or they have a house and they have insurance and all of the sorts of amenities of life, that they don't have to worry about the rest of their fellow humankind. So he says within the affluent democracy, the affluent discussion prevails, and within established framework, it tolerant to a large extent. All points of view can be heard. Again, this is that what affluent society gives us is that kind of abstract toleration of everything. All points of view can be heard: the communist and the fascist, the left and the right, the white and the Negro, the crusaders for armament and for disarmament. Moreover, in the endless dragging debates over the media, the stupid opinion is treated with the same respect as the intelligent one. The misinformed may talk as long as the informed, and the propaganda rides along with education, truth, and falsehood. This pure toleration of sense and nonsense is justified by the democratic argument that nobody, neither group nor individual, is in possession of the truth and capable of defining what is truth, what is right and wrong, good and bad. Therefore, all contesting opinions must be submitted to, quote, the people for its deliberation and choice. But I have already suggested that the democratic argument implies a necessary condition, namely that the people must be capable of deliberating and choosing on the basis of knowledge, that they must have access to authentic information, and that on this basis, their evaluation must be the result of autonomous thought. We must have the ability to educate our citizens. We must have the ability to educate our citizens in a liberal society that allows them access to good and authentic information as well, not to disinformation, right? Like the more recent efforts to dismantle all of public education and to privatize everything, to only allow access of quality education to somebody who goes to a charter school or a private school, right? This is completely antithetical to Marcuse. This is where we would situate Marcuse's thinking with the rise of the so-called New Left in the 1960s, which gave an expansion of access to higher education in the United States. Stuff that's being debated heavily right now in California, but also throughout the rest of the nation. What Marcuse is saying is that we need to have education in order to have a society. He's relying on classic liberal thinkers like John Stuart Mill. I would qualify that a little bit because we need to maybe be critical of the ways that classic liberalism had implicitly genocidal policies towards indigenous peoples, but that's just a discussion that's not on Marcuse's radar yet, mostly because I think he's unaware of it to one extent. We get more of it after the Native American movement, or the American Indian movement in AIM in the late 1960s. So I think the broader, like non-Indigenous society maybe gets a little bit more access after that. But at the same time, Marcuse has shifted in his direction at this point in the essay to analyzing mass society, and he's not so much trying to account for minorities within the society, um, except to say that that they have a difficult time ever being heard, right? He says in the contemporary period, the democratic argument for the abstract tolerance tends to be invalidated by the invalidation of the democratic process itself. Because when you have a completely diluted society that's uneducated, but you're calling it democratic, and people can't make good decisions on good information, then this is a bastardization of what democratic society is supposed to be in and of itself. And it becomes something like a tyranny of the majority, which is a loaded term that goes back to people like Plato and the Republic and Aristotle as well. So this is a much older argument. He says the avenues of entrance are closed to the meaning of words and ideas other than the established one, the established by the publicity of the powers that be and verified by their practices. Other words can be spoken and heard, other ideas can be expressed, but at the massive scale of the conservative majority outside such enclaves as the intelligentsia, they are immediately evaluated or automatically understood in terms of a public language, a language which determines a priori the direction in which the thought process itself moves. So we have like what we think of as free deliberative society. Everybody gets to have their own opinion and abstract tolerance. But what's really happening is that through propaganda, through media, our conversations are being shaped by powers that be, such that we think that we are actually thinking for ourselves and acting as free rational agents, but actually the whole frame of the discussion has been set up by people that are controlling us. And this might seem a little bit paranoid, even, for one instance, but when all we need to do is look at the internet now, right? All we need to do is look at like people who are on the far right who like they set up both far right and far left discourses, and they attack each other over and over again, and they benefit from the participation of all of these people contributing to them, just like Facebook benefits every time we work for free for them scrolling on Facebook or on Instagram or Meta for whatever the company's name is, right? We work for free for them. And now we're in like the Twitter debates and Elon Musk about like, what can be said or should be said in internet discourse and public discourse. And this is exactly why I think Marcuse's essay is fruitful for us to be thinking about in the 21st century here. He says, thus the process of reflection ends where it started, in the given conditions and relations. Self-validating the argument of discussion repels the contradiction because the antithesis is redefined in terms of the thesis. Again, he's reverting to Hegelian language here. He says, for example, thesis, we work for peace. Antithesis, we prepare for war, or even we wage war. Unification of opposites. This is dialectical thinking, right? Preparing for war is working for peace. Peace is redefined as necessarily in the prevailing situation, including the preparation for war or even war. In this Orwellian form, the meaning of the word peace is stabilized. Thus, the basic vocabulary of the Orwellian language operates as a priori categories for understanding, performing all content. These conditions invalidate the logic of tolerance, which involves the rational development of meaning and precludes the closing of meaning. Consequently, persuasion through discussion and the equal presentation of opposites, even where it is really equal, easily lose their liberating force as factors of understanding and learning. They are far more likely to strengthen the established thesis and to repel the alternatives. Our current society is making idiots out of us. And we claim in our idiocies to be free. Um, Impartiality, he says, to the utmost equal treatment of competing and conflicting issues is indeed a basic requirement for decision making in the democratic process. It's an equally basic requirement for defining the limits of tolerance. But in a democracy with totalitarian organization, objectivity may fulfill a very different function, namely to foster a mental attitude which tends to obliterate the difference between true and false, information and indoctrination, right and wrong. Think about that kind of statement in like the post, I don't know, Donald Trump era or something. Uh, Now we can agree or disagree with Marcuse, and you can even hear, I can even hear voices who identify as being on the right as agreeing with some of these statements of Marcuse's here. Except that he is claiming that truth does exist, and that truth, but that truth is a processional development that takes into this whole account of developing and coming into enlightenment and thought. But it's not the enlightenment thought of the individual rational subject. It's us being able to take into account a critical account of society at large. He says down below, as for example, when a magazine prints side by side a negative and a positive report on the FBI, it fulfills honestly the requirements of objectivity. However, the chances are that the positive wins because the image of the institution is deeply engraved in the minds of the people. Or if a newscaster reports the torture and murder of civil rights workers in the same unemotional tone he uses to describe the stock market or the weather, or with the same great emotion, which he says his commercials, then such objectivity is spurious. More, it offends against humanity and truth by being calm where one should be enraged, by refraining from accusation where accusation is in the facts themselves. The tolerance expressed in such impartiality serves to minimize, even absolve prevailing intolerance and suppression. If objectivity has anything to do with truth, and if truth is more than a matter of logic and science, then this kind of objectivity is false, and this kind of tolerance is inhuman. This is his critique of instrumental reason, and it's being embraced in liberal society. It is a certain critique of science itself. If we only take science in the abstract, instrumentalized version, and we don't have a way of doing philosophy alongside it, right? And that's his appeal back to the tradition of the humanities, of ethics, of critical thought. Same thing that Hannah Arendt is saying, like there's this, that we need to be able to be good thinkers in order to stave off the banality of evil. So both Marcuse and Hannah Arendt in my reading are far from nihilistic in this sense. Like Michael Walsh, some of the right-wing thinkers have claimed that they're nihilistic. And I see them both as promoting a particular kind of values that is deeply entrenched within Western civilizational tradition. Although current thinkers, like I've mentioned Samuel Moyn's book, are saying that maybe that they were mistaken to a certain extent in the ways that they were reading that liberal tradition themselves. Back to the essay here. And if it is necessary to break the established universe of meaning and to the practice enclosed in this universe in order to enable man to find out what is true and false, this deceptive impartiality would have to be abandoned. The people exposed to this impartiality are no tabula rasa. It's a classic John Locke's idea of that we are just shaped by our external environments. That tabula rasa in the singular idea, the blank slate, is foundational not only for liberal thought, but it becomes foundational for Jeffersonian thought and the thought of the American Revolution, right? That that shift that Hannah Arendt was talking about in on Revolution, that shift towards a society which can claim that all humans are created equal. That's not the way people thought in the ancient world at all. Right. So Marcuse is going a step further. He's saying that the people exposed to this impartiality are no tabula rasa. They are indoctrinated by the conditions under which they live and think and which they do not transcend. In linguistic and cognitive science, although he doesn't have the language for this yet, but in my notes, like on this, I've been thinking about a classic book by George Lakoff and Mark Johnson called Metaphors We Live By, where we're talking about cognitive framing. And his famous phrase, don't think of an elephant, right? Negation and positing, think of an elephant, don't think of an elephant. Positioning or positive and negative. When you say something like don't think of an elephant, you're the person's mind is not able to not think of an elephant. Instead, it reinforces the presence of the elephant, right? And so cognitive theory gives us a whole different take on how to think about what rationality is. That discourse really arises in the 70s and 80s and continues today in current brain science. It's not quite available to Marcuse at his point in history, but he's clearly trying to reconcile certain aspects of the Enlightenment rationality tradition with the 19th century moves towards thinking about society and groups and then of course he's engaging with liberal thinkers, the idea of a tabula rasa. Our society then we have to take in our social analysis, we have to take into account the way that we are socialized beings, not we are like by even by the time we start thinking of ourselves as individuals, we're already socialized into all sorts of things that are embedded in our social conditions. So he says this rupture, the prerequisite and token of all freedom of thought and of speech, cannot be accomplished within the established framework of abstract tolerance and spurious objectivity, because these are precisely the factors which precondition the mind against rupture. We need to be able to be thinking towards something. We need to be able to have that thinking challenged in a certain way, but not in an abstract anything goes sort of way. So we need to have a content that is capable of being ruptured instead of being contentless beings. Sometimes I've qualified, and I think I did this in an earlier essay, or a contextualized reading lecture, neoliberalism is trying to excavate all of our unconsciousness. Like we go into society, there's cameras everywhere. We're documenting ourselves willingly on the internet. Like we're uploading our opinions, our thoughts. It's becoming AI, all of this sort of stuff. And in doing so, it's not that we don't even have privacy anymore. That's not exactly, I mean, that might be part of this, but what I think what Marcuse is really saying is that we need to have a kind of sense, a self-reflective sense of who we are and what we're about. We need to have a kind of sense of values, even if those values are meant to be challenged, instead of just having an anything goes attitude. The factual barriers which totalitarian democracy erects against the efficacy of qualitative dissent are weak and pleasant enough compared with the practices of dictatorship, which claims to educate people in truth. All those people are going to say, like, what is Marcuse bitching about? At least we have it better off than the people in the Soviet Union. Marcuse says, yes, the society that we live in is, in the United States in the 1960s, is better off. But he says the question is whether or not this is the only alternative. He says, I shall presently try to suggest the direction in which an answer may be sought. In any case, the contrast is not between democracy and abstract dictatorship and dictatorship in the abstract, right? And this is like happens all the time. It happens all the time in my classes with students. It's like where you start talking about capitalism, it's like, or like somebody's like completely communist, or like or we start criticizing something about our liberal capitalist society, and somebody immediately says, "You communist, you dictator, you don't like that kind of rhetoric is being thrown around all over academia, not just with my students, but among academic professionals these days, who are claiming you're totalitarian, that kind of thinking, um, and those kinds of charges, without the kind of sensitivity that somebody like Marcuse is able to give to us. Bombastic rhetoric. He says, and to the degree to which freedom of thought involves the struggle against inhumanity, restoration of such freedom would also imply intolerance towards scientific research and the interest of deadly deterrence of abnormal human endurance under inhuman conditions, etc. I shall presently discuss the question as to who is to decide on the distinction between liberating and repressive human and inhuman teachings and practices. I've already suggested that this distinction is not a matter of value preference, but one of rational criteria. So this is a passage that could be read like, oh, see, Marcuse and the critical theorists, they can inform me like as a free thinker, um, uh, who is against the totalitarian regime of the COVID vaccine, for example, which has been a controversial case. Um, I wouldn't quite say that Marcuse's challenge to science here falls exactly into that category, although I am willing to have a little bit of slippage. I think what Marcuse would say about the COVID question and the vaccine question is, were necessary conditions being taken for um, uh, a view of the species at large, of the human species, and out of being able to protect our species from um, all sorts of devastating death. And in that sense, the duty or the obligation. So the Catholic Church kind of had a similar kind of obligatory response, like that yes, like maybe stem cells or something were used in developing the vaccine, which might be considered unethical, but the ethical duty of the Christian is to not put other human lives in danger. And so that duty exceeds whether or not you agree with how the vaccine was produced or something like that. It becomes a moral duty to your fellow citizens, rather than just the kind of individualized sense of like, I'm not going to do this just because somebody's telling me to do it, and I don't have to do what other people tell me to do. Um, and the sense there is that, yeah, there, like any vaccine we know, is going to be risky. Like there will be people who don't react well to it, who get sick or maybe even die from it, just like any medical procedure that you go into. It's statistically in there. But if you claim that the exceptional few cases is the rule for not having the majority of people vaccinated, that's bad logic and bad rationality, is what I think where Marcuse would fall on that particular question. And so he I don't think, for the same reasons that I brought up the climate change stuff earlier, he's challenging science here in the sense of instrumental reason. And instrumental reason is a way that science has been used to oppress and repress individuals. At the same time, he's going to get to this idea of subversion and the repressive desublimation, which he is a concept from Eros and Civilization. That's where he's heading here at the end. And so he's not just saying that science doesn't matter or anything like that, but he is saying that we have to have a human element of judgment that we bring to the knowledge that we humans produce. We need to have that kind of balancing aspect. And that's going to come in his society from subversive edges of society. This is why I think 1960s protest movements often take a lot from Marcuse, because Marcuse is telling us that we need to listen to the protesters at a certain extent. He says the subversive character of the restoration of freedom appears most clearly in the dimension of society where false tolerance and free enterprise do perhaps the most lasting damage, namely in business and publicity, in advertising and marketing and the making of business in the economy. So that's here's his economic approach, and he's saying that that's where we need to be looking for subversive ways of dealing with things. Against the emphatic insistence on the part of the spokesman for labor, I maintain that practices such as planned obsolescence, collusion between union leadership and management, slanted publicity are not simply imposed from above on a powerless rank and file, but tolerated by them and the consumer at large. It's not just the fact that we are oppressed by people who are rich, by people who are powerful. It's that they have created the conditions where we tolerate that and even work alongside them. And that's where things, and then we think of ourselves as being free in doing that, even though even though we're working against human freedom and liberation. So he says to discuss tolerance in such a society means to re-examine the issue of violence and the traditional distinction between violent and nonviolent action. He says the discussion should not from the beginning be clouded by ideologies which serve the perpetuation of violence. He's saying, I am not just saying that you should perpetuate violence. Even in the advanced centers of civilization, violence actually prevails. It is practiced by the police in prisons and mental institutions in fight against racial minorities. It is carried out by the defenders of metropolitan freedom into the backward countries. This violence indeed breeds violence. He's like, yes, there is this kind of oppressive violence that exists in our particular society. He says to refrain from violence in the face of vastly superior violence is one thing. Something like MLK, like the peaceful marches on Washington, right? To renounce or peaceful protests in the South. To renounce a prior violence against violence on ethical or psychological grounds because it may antagonize sympathizers is another. Nonviolence is normally not only preached to, but exacted from the weak. It is a necessity rather than a virtue, and normally it does not seriously harm the case of the strong. So what he's saying is that there's going to have to be some sort of a breaking point. We can't have the pacified nonviolence of status quo society that says never challenge the government, just do what you're told. Um, uh, the police are always right or something like that. And the unfortunate situation of marginalized folks is that they might their only recourse might be to nonviolent kind of protest. But as he's said already, can we rethink about a way to be deliberative towards the future? And this is where he interestingly turns, although only quickly, to The Wretched of the Earth, the Frantz Fanon book, although he's quoting Jean-Paul Sartre here. And I'm going to just read their translation here of the quote from Sartre's preface to Frantz Fanon's Wretched of the Earth, which comes out in the early 60s. Understand finally this. If violence were to begin this evening, if neither exploitation nor oppression ever existed in the world, perhaps concerted nonviolence could relieve the conflict. But if the whole governmental system and your nonviolent thoughts are conditioned by 1,000-year-old oppression, your passivity only serves to place you on the side of the oppressors. Now, his preface has been critiqued for kind of misunderstanding some things about Fanon. I'm not going to go into that here. I'm just going to mention it. But we've looked at Fanon a little bit through Glenshon Coulthard this quarter or this semester, and we're going to return to him next week, so he will be able to clarify a little bit more for us. I think the main point that Marcuse is saying here, and what Fanon's ultimate point is that yes, sometimes violence is necessary, as we will see in Concerning Violence. But Fanon's broader project, as Glenn Shung Coulthard really nicely analyzed for us in an earlier essay, Fanon's larger project is not to just say violence for the sake of violence itself. Fanon wants to account for the ways that we have been habituated, that the colonized subject has been habituated towards aspiring to the same values as the master in society. Even though the slave has been freed, the conceptual apparatus in the colonized person's mind still exists. And so they still can't be free. They're still oppressed, and they're even more oppressed in some ways, because they can't just externally revolt against the conditions of slavery itself, right? So that's where Marcuse is going here. In more current speak, we might talk about the colonization of the mind, but that's what Marcuse is talking again about mass society at this particular point. He says the ironical question, who educates the educators, i.e., the political leaders, applies to democracy. The only authentic alternative and negation of dictatorship with respect to this question would be a society in which the people have become autonomous free individuals, freed from the repressive requirements of a struggle of existence in the interest of domination, and as such human beings choosing their government and determining their life. Such a society does not yet exist anywhere in the world. In the meantime, the question must be treated in abstracto. Abstraction, not from the historical possibilities, but from the realities of prevailing societies. And I think that this is where I think he will critique some of the 1960s later protesters, the student movements. In some way, challenging the institutions is really, really good. It's what's necessary because the institutions have been controlled by corporate or oppressive governmental thought. And so the institutions themselves need to be liberated. But if your reaction to that, if your reaction to the critique of instrumental reason is to say that science doesn't exist, or screw all education and screw institutions and let's just go start a commune, like that's not exactly what Marcuse is saying here. Because he will call that again a version of repressive desublimation. We'll get to at the end here. He said, I thought that by virtue of its inner logic, withdrawal of tolerance from regressive movements and discriminatory tolerance in favor of progressive tendencies will be tantamount to the official promotion of subversion. The historical calculus of progress, which is actually the calculus of the prospective reduction of cruelty, misery, and suppression, seems to involve the calculated choice between two forms of political violence. That on the part of the legally constituted powers by their legitimate action and their tacit consent, or that by their inability to prevent violence, and that on the part of the potentially subversive movements. Moreover, with respect to the latter, a policy of unequal treatment would protect radicalism on the left against that of the right. And this is where, in current times, people are going to, like somebody who's just going to say, Marcuse is just biased. He's just a leftist. He's biased against the left. Why doesn't the right get to have freedom of speech or something like this? What he's saying in his broader argument, now that we can see it because we've been unpacking the essay for a long time, is that the embrace of the left is not just a political embrace of the left, it's about a progressive embrace of humanity at large, right? And that has been subversive. The left is subversive in a society based on a status quo conservatism that says that we're free when we are not exactly free. And that's where subversion the classic view of tolerance from classic liberalism must be taken into account. That must be partisan in this sense towards the left, instead of abstract tolerance that just says everybody has their equal perspective. Because what we must take into account our social obligation, not only to our society but to our species at large. And the current governing structures that we live in have created the conditions to destroy all of us, right? And if that's what's being supported by right-wing thought, and conservative thought, then that is why that should not be tolerated. It again is what situates him with the New Left as well, but I think he's got a much more nuanced and complex argument than just throwing him into a bucket of so-called like abstract leftism. He says, with all the qualifications and hypotheses based on an open historical record, it seems that violence emanating from the rebellion of the oppressed classes broke the historical continuum of injustice, cruelty, and violence and silence for a brief moment, but brief but explosive enough to achieve an increase in the scope of freedom of and justice. And so here he's talking about the French Revolution, English Civil Wars. He's looking at periods in history where violence broke out. And yes, that it's horrible. It's always horrible, but it sets the conditions for a more liberatory society. But the violence of something like National Socialism or Nazism is not for that, right? The violence of totalitarianism is not for, it doesn't, has not created the conditions for a freer society. It was a narrow escape. And for many millions of people, it was no escape at all, right? And so this is the post World War II moment where the UN is developed and international discussions are happening, and then we get globalization as an idea arising in the early 70s. He says, in contrast, the one historical change from one social system to another, marking the beginning of a new period in civilization, which was not sparked and driven by an effective movement from below, namely the collapse of the Roman Empire in the West, brought about a long period of regression for long centuries until a new higher period of civilization was painfully born in the violence of the heretic revolts of the 13th century and the peasant and laborer revolts of the 14th century. Again, he's doing here exactly the same sort of reading back into European history and even Euro-Christian history that Hannah Arendt was doing. He's citing Barrington Moore's book, Social Origins of Dictatorship and Democracy, so we could throw Barrington Moore in here as well. They do not have indigenous um, issues on their map at all right now. And again, I would say both for Arendt and for Marcuse, from my own current perspective, because I'm working a lot with indigenous theory and people like Glenn John Coulthard, that would be an updated critique of Marcuse from my particular perspective, because he's reverting to a kind of Western civilization narrative here and trying to and to a version of humanism in that particular tradition without doing much of the critical work of critiquing what's at stake with that humanism, how it might be narrow, how it might be only framed in terms of Christianity or only in a sense of a particular version of rationality going back to Aristotle, right? So that's just like where I would place a particular current critique. Of course, other current critical theorists like Moyne might go even further in charges against Marcuse. Or I keep saying Samuel Moyne, but Gabriel Rockhill too, right? The Critical Theory Center, or the Critical Theory Workshop. He says here, the long series of dynastic and imperialistic wars, the liquidation of Spartacus in Germany in 1919, fascism and Nazism did not break, but rather tightened and streamlined the continuum of suppression. I said emanating from among ruling classes, to be sure. There's hardly any organized violence from above that does not mobilize and activate the mass support from below. He would say about the uprising in January 6th in the United States a few years ago, Marcuse would say, this is a very good example of people doing the active work from below while having been being manipulated by people who are in power, telling them that they don't have power, which is something they don't need to be told because they're economically like disenfranchised to begin with for the large part of working class American society, whether we're talking about, I'm cutting across racial divides and gender divides there, right? That people who are economically impoverished are already in a state of resentment and rage because they don't feel like they're getting what they need in life. And if somebody's feeding them the idea like, yes, you should be mad, but they're not doing the kinds of policy decisions that will benefit these people, then folks are being duped. And so he says that yes, like we see that the appearance of a mass revolt from below, from I would say maybe just disenfranchised, socioeconomically disenfranchised peoples, is something that happens through the manipulation of media, through mass society, um, through I don't know, Celebrity Apprentice or whatever shows you're watching. Um, so he says liberating tolerance then would mean intolerance against movements from the right and toleration of movements from the left. As to the scope of this tolerance and intolerance, it would extend to the stage of action as well as the discussion of propaganda, of deed as well as word. And so we need to be able to have the critical faculty to analyze rationality, to do critical thinking. It should be a life skill for us. I tend to agree with Marcuse there, hence my critical theory or Center for Critical and Cultural Theory. He says, but the spreading of the word could have been stopped before it was too late. Like he's talking about Nazi Germany here. He says, like Weimar Republic's liberalism opened the door to the Nazis and their propaganda, and they spread their propaganda and they convinced the public to go along with their policies of exterminating the Jews. If there had been more critical faculties, that process could have been stopped in the making. He says, if democratic tolerance had been withdrawn when the future leaders started their campaign, mankind would have had a chance of avoiding Auschwitz and a world war. If liberal tolerance would have been intolerant to the hatred and the lies that the Nazis were spreading about Jews, if we were intolerant of that disinformation and misinformation, then it could have held off Auschwitz. But that would have meant something like censoring people who are spewing that kind of hatred. He says, I maintain that our society is in such an emergency today. So he comes back into the 1960s, and that it has become the normal state of affairs. Different opinions and, quote, philosophies can no longer compete peacefully for adherence and persuasion on rational grounds. The, quote, marketplace of ideas is organized and delimited by those who determine the national and individual interest. In this society, for which the ideologists have proclaimed the end of ideology, the false consciousness has become the general consciousness, from the government down to its last objects. The small and powerless minorities which struggle against the false consciousness and its beneficiaries must be helped. Their continued existence is more important than the preservation of abused rights and liberties which grant constitutional powers to those who oppress these minorities. How is this part of part of the New Left? This is like he, as a policy expert, he would be all for the expansion of higher education to people of color, to more women, to immigrants, the expansion of a authentic education system. But that expansion of education and higher access to higher education is exactly what the right-wing conservatives in the 1970s start reacting against. It's what creates the Christian right in the late 1970s, in part, is the Liberty University in Virginia is being told that they will lose their nonprofit status if they do not integrate their students, their student population, right? Because as a private religious institution, you can have tax exemptness in the United States, but not if you're, according to the IRS at that moment in time, not if you don't embrace a more inclusive society, right? And so that creates this tension. And then we get culture wars in the 80s that are still going on. And we get this kind of discourse on inclusion versus exclusion. In the next sentence here, that there's another reference to Frantz Fanon. He says, "It should be evident by now that the exercise of civil rights by those who don't have them presupposes the withdrawal of civil rights from those who prevent their exercise, and that the liberation of the damned of the earth or the wretched of the earth presupposes the suppression not only of their old but of their new masters." Right. So we'll come back to that. I'm not going to keep going, but that's definitely a reference to concerning violence, the first essay in Wretched of the Earth, which we'll be reading after this. He says, more than ever, the proposition holds true that progress and freedom demands progress in the consciousness of freedom. It is not the abstract freedom of don't tread on me. It's not the abstract freedom of I get to do whatever I want. It's not the abstract freedom of screw everybody else in society. I'm just taking care of myself and my own. That's not what freedom is. It's not what freedom, how freedom was conceived by the early liberal thinkers and the liberatory movements that broke up feudalism. It's not even part of those who were Enlightenment rationalists, who were claiming a kind of cultivated upward kind of reason, nor of the more political liberals like John Stuart Mill. After political liberalism becomes like more named in the early 1800s, that's like where we start seeing people referring in print to the liberals. Um, John Stuart Mill says, no, there's a cultivating process, but the cultivating process is all about a recognition of the need to attend to social matters and not only to individual matters. And so this is going to be consciousness of freedom for Marcuse combined with political education. We're going to see in debates, about university education in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and up to today, that the big cry against universities has been, among the right wing especially, has been its inclusion of all sorts of minorities, its uh, uh, its politicization of identity categories and with so-called identity politics that arises in the 1980s, all of that sort of stuff that I think in many ways is a bastardization of what Marcuse is calling for, but at least at his moment in the mid 1960s, he's saying that we need to address this as we need to address education as a society. He says this means that previously neutral, value-free formal aspects of learning and teaching now become on their own grounds and in their own right political. Learning to know the facts, the whole truth, and to comprehend it is the radical criticism throughout intellectual subversion. In a world in which the human faculties and needs are arrested or perverted, autonomous thinking leads to a, quote, perverted world, contradiction and counter-image of the established world of repression. And this contradiction is not simply stipulated by simply the product of confused thinking and fantasy, but is the logical development of the given and existing world. In that sense, he sounds like Adorno and Levinas and Horkheimer, right? To the degree to which this development is actually impeded by the sheer weight of a repressive society and the necessity of making a living in it, repression, living in it, repression invades the academic enterprise itself, even prior to all restrictions on academic freedom. The preempting of the mind vitiates impartiality and objectivity. Unless the student learns to think in the opposite direction, he will be inclined to place the facts into a predominant framework of values. Scholarship, i.e., the acquisition of communication of knowledge, prohibits the purification and isolation of facts from the context of the whole truth. An essential part of the latter is the recognition of the frightening extent to which history is made and recorded by and for the victors, that is, the extent to which history was the development of oppression. And this oppression is in the facts themselves, which it establishes, thus they themselves carry a negative value as part of an aspect of their facticity. To treat the great causes or the great crusades against humanity, like those against the Albigensians, with the same impartiality as the desperate struggles for humanity means neutralizing their oppositional historical function, reconciling the executioners with their victims, and distorting the record. So in the 1970s, we will see the explosion of Africana or African American studies or Black studies movements, and a lot of attention to historically marginalized populations. Now, people on the right hate this sort of thing. They call it divisive, because when we're recognizing the different struggles of different peoples, we're pushing away from the kinds of version of historical movement towards the future that just is about accumulation of wealth and that is indiscriminatory against anything except accumulating wealth. Um, it will become in the 1980s the culture wars. It continues today in higher education. And Marcuse is saying that, yeah, like there is danger in university education if students are not taught critical thinking, right? If they're not able to learn to authenticate the information that they're getting in universities, then in that sense, then universities are just the tools of the elite to make propaganda and to create a status quo society, right? And so that's where we're hearing charges today, especially from the right, that the education in the United States is just controlled by the so-called liberal or leftist elite. I would qualify that kind of thing by saying, as I've said in earlier lectures, that like, the professors at Yale, tenured professors, who are going into the State Department or something like that, like that they're operating at a completely different level than me teaching at the most diverse urban four-year institution in the state of Colorado that is also unsurprisingly the least funded institution, and where tenure is completely eroded, and where we see more and more of a business type of model being applied by administrators at the expense of those of us who are professors, leading some of us to, like myself, to go out on my own as a rogue professor, now adjuncting at various different universities and creating a critical theory center for the general public, right? To bring information to the general public. Does that mean I dumb down the information? No, it's really hard information to be dealing with. And do I recognize that there's something neoliberal about like starting my own quote business as opposed to the university? Yeah, that's part of the difficulty of living right now, and it's not like my business makes any money. So I mean, if you've looked at how many Patreon subscribers I have, I don't really make money from this business. So it's about me thinking alongside you, the public, and working through this stuff myself. Speaking into my computer is not about supporting YouTube or Meta or whatever social media sites. It's about me maneuvering through the process of thought alongside other people. And I'm also not open to consumer critique, like really ridiculous YouTube comments on my stuff. I do what I can, and if you don't like it, start your own theory center. Okay, as we go into the ending of the essay here, he's going to return to education again, and he says that the individual potential is first a negative one, a portion of the potential of his society, of aggression, guilt, feeling, ignorance, resentment, cruelty, which vitiate his life instincts. If the identity of the self is to be more than immediate realization of this potential, undesirable for the individual as a human being, then it requires the repression and sublimation of conscious transformation. This is where we're getting that Freudian thought from my last essay. Society needs to tell us that we can't have all of the things that we want, right? Society has to tell us that we need some sort of balance, that we need to think of, we can't just have sex with anybody that we see on the street. We can't touch other people's bodies on non-consensually just because it's something that we want. Um, this process involves at each stage To use the ridiculed terms which here reveal their succinct concreteness, the negation of negation, mediation of the immediate, and identity is no more and no less than this process. Alienation is the constant and essential element of identity and the objective side of the subject, and is not, as it is made to appear today, a disease, a psychological condition. Freud knew well the difference between progressive and regressive, liberating and destructive repression. Going back to civilization and its discontents, the problem that Freud is dealing with there, and that's kind of on Marcuse's mind here, is not the fact that sublimation exists, right? Like the ego is, or the id is driven by desire. The ego is the formation that creates a connection through desire for the object out in the world, the object desired, the hamburger I want to have for lunch. Is it's I desire it because it's lack, it's not in me, and so the derive of desire is towards that. That's like another way of thinking about that Hegelian process of love, right? As a desire, as an entire completion of a process, and not just like emphasizing the object itself. The superego comes in and it's aligned in Freud, yeah, probably like wrongly with the idea of the law of the father, but the superego acts at the level of society to give us morality, to give us a sense that we live in the world with other people. And in that sense, we like repression comes not just from our own family situations, but it comes from a situation at large. And when we align with the society as individuals, that's when we come into a so-called higher capacity of reason in this particular reading, as opposed to bad immediacy of getting whatever we want whenever we want. But consumer society tells us that we can have whatever we want whenever we want. We can just get another credit card and keep buying and like leveraging our debt in consumer society. So consumer society, according to Marcuse, and this is where we get Eros and Civilization and his other book, One Dimensional Man, it desublimates things that have been repressed by telling us we can have whatever we want. The students at Berkeley in the 1960s who were saying death to the death drive and critiquing Freud in that particular way are calling for like desublimation of a society that has been repressive, that's telling us like we all need to be conformist in this particular way to a society that's producing nuclear weapons that are going to destroy all of us anyway. So why don't we just say fuck it and go have a sexual revolution? Why don't we liberate our bodies, liberate our minds? This is like a big part of countercultural movements, as Theodore Roszak calls them in the 1960s. And it's activist in the sense that like what you do with your body is you liberate your body from the repressive controls of society. On the one hand, Marcuse would be like, that's interesting as a site of subversion of the dominant society. But what happens in a consumer society is that that becomes just another way of getting what I want for myself right now in the terms in a kind of immediacy. And it doesn't stop, unfortunately, it doesn't stop the mass accumulation of nuclear arms by the repressive state. Right. And going and starting your commune or going off grid or whatever that impulse is, going to Burning Man and saying fuck it all and being hedonistic, all of that sort of stuff. That is not a progressive thing for someone like Marcuse. It's not critical in this, even if Burning Man is like trying to give us a different alternative for the dominant economic situation that we live in. Actually, what he would say is that it's showing that we are claiming that we're free when we are not free. We're acting like some individual hedonistic choice is the embodiment of freedom, but it is a cheapened form of what freedom actually ought to be and how it ought to be conceived. And so in that sense, Marcuse he comes up with the theory of repressive desublimation, that he calls it repressive. And when somebody is acting and saying like, I'm free, I'm so like, I listen to all this punk rock, like, yeah, like fucking fuck everything, was punk rock. And it's like punk rock is as one of my students was saying in class last week, it's like, well, it kind of opened up the punkers who are like the extension of the hippies, like Patti Smith or something like that, the extension of the Beat movement, who are critical of society, but it also opened up like skinhead movements and Nazi punks and things like that. So that's like exactly a way of thinking about like what Marcuse is saying about what abstract tolerant society is. It's just like we can't tell who is what. And then we're like going to clubs and maybe it's like maybe you punch out a Nazi like who likes this other band or something that you don't like, and then you go home with your friends, you're gonna fight and you feel really good about it. It's like that, none of that does anything to stop nuclear arms races or repressive government policies or the extractive capitalism that makes the 1% of 1%ers in the world after COVID, for example, being 40% richer than they were before COVID at the expense of the rest of humanity, right? So even culture and our cultural products can be ways that we think that we're being expressive, and even liberatory in our expression, but that can definitely be captured as well. And so what seems to mask itself as liberation or as desublimation, like I'm liberating my unconscious desires, are done within a frame that is already oppressive. And that's the problem that Marcuse sees that we are in the 1960s, and that in some ways, for me anyway, resonates with issues today. Now, one last qualifying piece here. I will say that, again, one of the current critiques of um, these mid 20th century critical theorists is that they, in Samuel Moyn's argument, that they give us they claim that we should have a less liberated sense of what liberalism is, that we should, and that in that move towards austerity, that we shouldn't hope for more in society, that we open up, that the Cold War liberals, as Moyne calls them, actually open up neoliberalism, which is actually more totalitarian society. I think that there might be something to that critique as well there. Like, and this is why I think it's useful right now, in more than just a historical sense or intellectual history sense, to return to these critical thinkers and to the question of doing critical theory in the mid 20th century. I'm less concerned with the idea that they gave up on a kind of Marxian project. Although I'm sympathetic to the way that what might have been expressed as liberatory in Marxism has became part of the status quo itself too. So I'm open to that charge as well. So there's more to be said about this, but I do think that Marcuse's idea of repressive desublimation, although it's very complicated, is still useful for us in critical theory today. And with that, I'm going to end this probably really long lecture. It felt long to me. Have a great evening, morning, afternoon, whenever, wherever you are. Thanks for paying attention. I'll stop sharing my screen here, and we'll catch up with you another time. If you can and have the means, support us on Patreon. That is a talking about my poor economic conditions earlier. But anyway, we'll see you another time.